The Korean Mafia boss was stepping away from his armored sedan when a small, hesitant touch brushed against his tattooed hand. It wasn't the cold steel of a gun or the edge of a blade. It was a single, crumpled $2 bill. Kim Woo-jin looked down. Standing there was a little girl, Cecilia, her hair tangled and her shoes worn to the soles. Her hands shook as she offered the money, clutched like it was her entire world. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the city hum. "This is all I have." Woo-jin's enforcers closed in instantly, their movements sharp and aggressive. But with a single, calm gesture, he signaled them to stand down. In his world, people paid in respect or terror, never in pocket change. He sank to one knee, bringing himself level with her wide, fearful eyes. "What do you want, kid?" he asked, his voice a low gravel. Cecilia swallowed hard, her small frame trembling. "I need you to help me," she said, "because the police can't." Woo-jin froze. She leaned in closer, her breath hitching. "They told me if I said anything, my mom would never come home." That was when he saw it. The faint bruising on her small knuckles, the jagged tear in her sleeve, and the frantic way she scanned the shadows behind her. The boss slowly reached out and took the $2. He didn't need the money, but he knew that whatever she was buying was worth far more than a few dollars. "Stay with me until the end, because what Cecilia asked for next would haunt a man who believed he had already seen the worst of humanity." Kim Woo-jin stepped out of the black sedan, the heavy door closing with a thud that seemed to echo through the rain-slicked streets of the district. Every movement he made was deliberate, radiating the controlled intensity of a man who didn't just walk through the city. He owned the ground beneath his feet. At 38, he was the apex predator of the local underworld, a figure defined by sharp suits, neatly combed back hair, and the dark, intricate ink that crept up his hands like shadows reaching for his throat. To the shop owners locking their doors and the street vendors lowering their eyes, he was known simply as the Dragon. His reputation was built on a foundation of cold, surgical calculation. For 15 years, Woo-jin had transformed chaos into clockwork. He didn't rely on mindless brutality. He relied on the absolute certainty of his word. In his territory, the rules were absolute. You paid for protection, you kept your mouth shut, and you never ever disrupted the flow of business. Those who followed the rules lived in a strange, fragile peace. Those who didn't usually found themselves at the bottom of the docks, forgotten by time and the tide. Behind him, a silent enforcer maintained a watchful distance, a human shadow ensuring the dragon's path remained unobstructed. This was the routine. This was the order Woo-jin had sacrificed his humanity to build. He had long ago discarded the luxury of emotion, viewing empathy as a structural weakness that could bring an entire empire crumbling down. As he stood under the flickering neon signs of the district, his gaze remained focused and piercing, scanning for the slightest hint of defiance. The city hummed with a nervous energy, the kind that only exists when everyone knows the most dangerous man in the room has just arrived. For Woo-jin, this silence was the ultimate form of respect, a quiet, terrifying acknowledgement that in this concrete jungle, there was only one king, and he moved with the chilling grace of a predator who had forgotten how to feel anything but the weight of his own power. The rhythmic clicking of Woo-jin's polished shoes against the pavement stopped abruptly when a small, timid weight brushed against the back of his hand. His enforcers reacted with the fluid, lethal speed of a coiled spring, their shadows lengthening as they stepped forward to neutralize the threat. But Woo-jin's hand rose, a silent command that froze them in their tracks. He turned slowly, expecting a desperate debtor or a foolish rival, but his gaze fell much lower. There stood Cecilia, a fragment of a person lost in the vastness of the city, her messy hair catching the dim light and her thin shoes barely protecting her feet from the cold. Her hands were shaking, but her grip was iron-tight on a single crumpled $2 bill. She held it up like a sacred offering, her small frame vibrating with a terror she was fighting to contain. "Please," she whispered, the word fragile and raw. "This is all I have." Woo-jin looked at the bill, then at the girl. In his world, people paid in blood, territory, or deep-seated fear, but never in the meager contents of a child's piggy bank. He sank to one knee, ignoring the protest of his joints and the confused stares of his men, until he was eye level with her. "What do you want, kid?" he asked, his voice maintaining its usual gravelly edge but lacking its customary bite. Cecilia swallowed hard, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears as she forced the words past the lump in her throat. "I want to hire you," she said, using the word with a heartbreaking, businesslike solemnity. "I want you to help me. Because the police won't." The admission hung in the air, cold and heavy. Wu Jin felt a flicker of something long dormant stir in his chest as she leaned closer, her voice trembling with a secret that was too heavy for a 7-year-old to carry. "They said if I told anyone, my mom wouldn't come home." He watched her glance frantically over her shoulder, her bruised knuckles and torn sleeve telling a story of a struggle she should never have known. In that moment, the dragon of the district realized this wasn't a request. It was a contract he was powerless to refuse. Wu Jin remained motionless, his eyes locked on the girl's bruised knuckles, a sight that stood in jarring defiance of the orderly world he claimed to control. He signaled for his men to create a wider perimeter, granting them a fragile pocket of privacy amidst the city's indifferent hum. "Tell me everything, Cecilia," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steady frequency designed to anchor her. "How long has it been?" The girl's lip quivered as she looked down at her worn shoes. 3 nights, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the confession. She explained that after the men with the shadows in their eyes took her mother, she had retreated to their small apartment, locking every bolt just as she had been taught. For 72 hours, the silence of the rooms had been her only companion. She spoke of surviving on the meager remains of a peanut butter jar and the stale crackers she found at the back of the pantry, eating only when the hunger became sharp enough to rival her fear. Wu Jin felt a cold, jagged edge of anger press against his ribs. He pictured the girl sitting in the dark, jumping at every groan of the floorboards, waiting for a key to turn in a lock that remained still. She had stayed there, a 7-year-old soldier guarding a ghost of a home, because she believed her mother's return depended on her bravery. "I tried to be quiet," she added, her eyes searching his for approval. "They told me that if the neighbors heard me crying, they'd come back for me, too." The dragon of the district looked at the $2 bill still clutched in his hand, then back at the small, exhausted child who had navigated a nightmare alone. In 15 years, he had settled countless debts and managed vast territories, but he realized he had never encountered a price as high as the one this girl had paid in silence. The rigid detachment he wore like armor didn't just crack. It shattered, leaving him exposed to a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since he was a boy himself, wishing for a savior who never came. Wu Jin's jaw tightened as the pieces of the girl's story began to form a picture of predatory greed. He led Cecilia toward the sheltered entrance of a nearby cafe, his presence acting as a silent barrier that kept the city's chaos at bay. With a subtle nod, he signaled his lieutenant to bring him the digital ledger of neighborhood accounts. As the screen glowed in the dim light, Wu Jin's eyes narrowed, scanning for any trace of the name Smith or the address Cecilia had provided. "They said it was because of my dad," Cecilia whispered, her small fingers twisting the hem of her torn sleeve. She explained how the men had stormed their home, shouting about $20,000 that had supposedly been owed for years. Her father had been a construction worker, a man of simple means who had died in a tragic accident a year prior. He was a man who had never stepped foot in a casino or touched a loan shark's money. Yet these men, members of the Choi Syndicate, had arrived like vultures to claim a debt that didn't exist. The phantom debt was a tactic Wu Jin knew well. It was a low-level extortion used to trap the vulnerable in a cycle of fear. The Choi crew wasn't looking for a repayment of cash they knew the family didn't have. They were looking for leverage to justify the kidnapping of Rosa, Cecilia's mother. They had even gone as far as to demand she show them their bank account, mocking the $43 that was all they had left in the world. To a man like Wu Jin, 20,000 was pocket change spent on a whim, but to a widow struggling to keep the lights on, it might as well have been 20 million. The realization that a rival syndicate was using such desperate, dishonorable methods in his territory made the dragon's blood run cold. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fact that these animals believed they could terrorize a child under his nose without consequence. The debt was a lie, a thin veil for a trafficking operation that violated every rule Wu Jin lived by. As he looked at Cecilia, he knew that the only way to settle this debt was to ensure that the Choi syndicate paid for their arrogance in a currency far more permanent than paper. Wu Jin stood up slowly, the $2 bill disappearing into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit. A contract signed in the humblest of currencies. He turned away from the flickering neon of the cafe, his eyes finding his lieutenant, Min Ho, who stood like a statue in the rain. The air around the dragon seemed to drop several degrees as he spoke, his voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through the city's din. "Call the captains," he commanded, the words sharp and final. "I want the docks, the downtown enforcers, and the specialists from the outskirts. Everyone. Tonight, we aren't just patrolling. We're cleaning house." Within minutes, the district began to shift. The usual rhythm of the criminal underworld was replaced by a cold, mechanical efficiency as black SUVs began to thread through the side streets like a funeral procession for the Choi syndicate. In the back room of his headquarters, Wu Jin stood before a long table covered in maps and digital surveillance feeds. 30 of his most disciplined men assembled, their faces grim. These were ex-military and former specialists who understood that some jobs were for profit, but this job was for something else entirely. Wu Jin didn't speak of territory or lost revenue. Instead, he placed a photo of Cecilia's mother on the table, a woman whose only crime was being a widow in a neighborhood that had temporarily forgotten who guarded it. "The Choi crew thinks they can snatch mothers from their doorsteps while a child waits in the dark for 3 days, he said, his gaze sweeping the room like a blade. "They think they can operate without honor in my streets." He checked the weight of his custom pistol, the movement practiced and cold. This was no longer a professional dispute over boundaries or collection fees. It had become a crusade for the soul of the district. The dragon was no longer just maintaining order. He was hunting for justice. As the crews checked their weapons and synchronized their watches, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, personal resolve. Wu Jin looked out at the rain, thinking of the $2 bill and the girl who believed he could do the impossible. He wasn't just a boss tonight. He was a shield, and the Choi syndicate was about to learn that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The convoy of black SUVs moved through the industrial district like a funeral procession of ghosts, their headlights cut to minimize detection as they approached the rusted perimeter of Warehouse 15. Kim Woo Jin sat in the lead vehicle, his eyes cold and fixed on the jagged silhouette of shipping containers stacked like a child's forgotten blocks against the moonlight. This was the heart of the Choi syndicate's operation, a place where people were treated as nothing more than inventory to be moved across borders. At 11:30 p.m., the Dragon gave the signal. The breach was not a loud, clumsy explosion, but a surgical strike carried out by men who moved with the fluid synchronization of a single predator. Specialist teams fanned out across the north and south entrances, neutralizing guards with a silent, terrifying efficiency that left no room for alarm. Wu Jin led the center charge, his heavy boots sounding a rhythmic death knell on the concrete floor as they moved toward Container 7, the location his scouts had identified as the holding area for the newest merchandise. The air inside the warehouse was thick with the smell of stagnant salt air and the metallic tang of fear. When they reached the central office container, 2 Choi sentries fumbled for their weapons, their eyes widening at the sight of the man they had believed was too busy with business to care about a missing widow. They didn't even have time to scream before Wu Jin's men cleared the path. The Dragon stepped over the fallen without a glance. His focus narrowed to the heavy steel door of the container at the far end of the row. With a sharp metallic groan, the doors were wrenched open. The beam of Wu Jin's flashlight cut through the dark, revealing a scene that caused his athletic frame to tense with a suppressed, visceral rage. Rosa Martinez was there, slumped against a crate, her eyes unfocused from whatever sedative they had used to keep her quiet. Beside her were 3 other women, huddled in a corner, their faces masks of disbelief at the sight of their rescuers. "Get them out," Wu Jin commanded, his voice a low, lethal rasp that brooked no delay. As his men began the delicate work of extraction, the Dragon turned toward the sound of footsteps approaching from the back of the complex. The Choi brothers were finally coming to see what was dismantling their empire. Wu Jin adjusted his custom grip on his pistol, the $2 contract in his pocket feeling heavier than all the millions he had earned in his lifetime. The tactical portion of the evening was over. Now it was time for the cleanup. The black SUV pulled to a smooth stop in front of the corner store, its headlights cutting through the lingering midnight mist. The fluorescent lights of the shop hummed with a quiet intensity, casting a stark, artificial glow onto the sidewalk where the dragon's world had shifted only hours before. Kim Woo-jin stepped out, his movements fluid despite the exhaustion weighing on his athletic frame. He turned to open the rear door, offering a steady hand to Rosa Martinez as she stepped onto the pavement, her legs still trembling from the ordeal. Inside the store, Cecilia sat perched on a stool behind the counter, her small legs swinging back and forth in a restless rhythm. She had been staring at the door with an intensity that ignored the crackers and juice boxes Mrs. Chun had placed before her. When the chime above the door finally rang, the girl's heart seemed to stop for a heartbeat before she launched herself across the floor. "Mama!" she cried, the sound raw and filled with a relief that no 7-year-old should ever have to feel. Rosa caught her daughter in a crushing embrace, burying her face in Cecilia's messy hair, as they both collapsed into a tangle of tears and whispered promises. Woo-jin watched them from the doorway, his silhouette imposing against the night, yet his expression had softened into something uncharacteristically human. He reached into the breast pocket of his dark suit and pulled out the crumpled $2 bill. Walking over with measured steps, he knelt one last time to Cecilia's level and gently pressed the paper into her small, sticky palm. "Your payment is being refunded," he said, a slight, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. When the girl looked at him with confusion, clutched $2 in hand, he shook his head slowly. "The job is completed at no charge, kid. You gave me something worth far more than money tonight." He stood up, adjusting his cuffs, the cold dragon of the district replaced by a man who had rediscovered his own soul in the eyes of a child. As he turned to leave, he handed Rosa a simple card with a single number. "If anyone ever bothers you again, you call me," he stated with absolute finality. Sophie already paid for a lifetime of protection. 3 months later, the cold glass and steel of Kim Woo-jin's private office felt different than it had for the last 15 years. The sprawling map of his territory still dominated the far wall, a complex grid of districts and docks marking his absolute control over the city's commerce. But beside the cold data of his empire hung a new addition, a hand-drawn picture on a piece of crinkled notebook paper. It depicted 3 stick figures, 2 large, 1 small, holding hands under a jagged yellow sun. At the bottom, in careful, 7-year-old handwriting, it read, "Thank you, Mr. Kim. Love, Cecilia and Mama." Woo-jin stood before the drawing, the light from the city below reflecting off his dark suit. He never kept trophies of his conquests or framed newspaper clippings of his disappearances. But this fragment of paper had become the most important document in his possession. It was a reminder that the weight of his name was no longer just about the fear it inspired, but the safety it guaranteed. He had spent a lifetime believing that a mafia boss's only duty was to the bottom line. Yet a single $2 contract had rewritten his internal code. Every day since the raid on Warehouse 15, his crews had moved with a different kind of purpose. They weren't just collecting protection fees. They were actually providing it. The Choi Syndicate had been erased from the city's memory, and the phantom debts that once plagued the vulnerable had vanished under the Dragon's watch. Woo-jin had realized that protecting people wasn't a structural weakness. It was the ultimate expression of power. As the anniversary of that night approached each year, a small envelope would inevitably arrive at his headquarters. Inside was always the same thing, a $2 bill and a note that read, "For the next kid who needs a hero." Woo-jin kept every single one in a locked drawer, treating them with more reverence than the millions flowing through his bank accounts. He had done terrible things to terrible people to maintain his throne, and the lines between good and bad remained blurred in his world of shadows. But looking at the stick-figure family on his wall, Kim Woo-jin finally understood what he was really protecting. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the city needs to remember that courage doesn't come from a gun or a title. It comes from a 7-year-old girl with hope and the bravery to ask for help. In the heart of the district, the dragon remained, no longer just a predator, but a silent, unwavering shield.